I'd like to welcome Uncle Bruce Pascoe to the stage.
Thank you very much. I'd like to acknowledge the moon, Uncle George, Uncle Philip, for their welcome to country earlier today. But I really needed to feel sure that I could talk on this country. And so this morning I travelled with the moon to see country and to hear this country's story. They're very kind words about Dark Emu, but this is not my story. This is a story of our country, and the story that Australia hasn't really heard. And it's a great story. It's a great world story. And I was forced into writing it by my grandmother, who made me go to school because I didn't want to, and by the old people who shocked me when I went to them asking for a story about my family. They refused to talk to me about my family until they had finished telling me the story of the country, because without that they would not talk to me about individual people. I had to know the story as the old people knew it. When I was learning that story, I was so ignorant. That's what offended the old people, my ignorance. And I was checking up on those stories in the library, which is like cheating on the old people. But nothing in my education, and I was already a university graduate, nothing in my education had told me what had happened in this country. And it was shameful to be as old as I was and to know nothing. And so I began to learn that story, because one of the things that I'd been told was that within a few hundred metres of where I lived, up to 70 Aboriginal people, the Gadibanant of Cape Otway, had been killed there. And I knew nothing about it. But by walking 300 metres and looking again, having a different look at the country, the evidence was everywhere. And I found on the sand dunes of the Cape there, and these Middens in your country, I don't like to use the word Middens because it's a Scottish word which means rubbish dump. And you know, it's just a living site for our old people. And some people were buried there, and some dogs were buried there on my country. And in that Midden, which some archaeologists are telling us is the longest unbroken shell midden in the southern hemisphere, but our people knew that anyway. They knew how long it was. But I found a little stone that's only that big, and it had notches all the way down one side, and in the middle it had holes, different shaped holes, right down from a big one to a tiny one. And on the beside that there were these lines. And I looked at it and looked at it for a long time, and I eventually realised it was a seamstress's kit, that the lines were for sharpening those old ladies' needles. The holes were for helping to sharpen the point, and the notches were for cutting thread. It was a seamstress's kit. And none of us at school, whether we're black or white in this country, ever learned about our people being seamstresses. And I know the lady who started making possum skin cloaks in Victoria, a great woman, Vicky Cousins, really great woman, great Australian. She started sewing the cloaks again because one day in the museum she was surprised by finding a possum skin cloak, and she recognised all the rivers, all the lakes, all the ridges, because that was her grandmother's cloak. She had been buried in that cloak. So how did the cloak end up in the museum? They dug her up. How do you treat people like that? Anyway, Vicky looked at that coat and she was able to learn how to make new ones. And so that is what she's been doing, and she's taught other people in New South Wales, other parts. I don't know whether she's been up here, but those cloaks were for people down south, living in cold country, but everybody had their craft. Everybody could sew. And I wish I'd known that as a child. I wish I'd known that when my uncle was trying to tell me about our people. And I was so shocked by what he was telling me that at that stage I couldn't believe. I wish he was here now. But when I started learning about those wars between white people and black people for the land, I ended up writing a book called A Convincing Ground, because there was one famous event down near Portland in Victoria where sealers killed a lot of our people because our old people were claiming a whale that had washed up on the beach there, because traditionally our people ate whale, and we used whale as a cure for many illnesses. But the sealer said, no, that's our whale. And so 40 or 50 people were killed, all our people of course, and that's the theme of that book. I call it Convincing Ground after that massacre. And I then started collecting material for Dark Emu, because while I was researching Convincing Ground, I was finding out all this information I just could not understand about our people harvesting grain. And it really shocked me. And I started talking to other people about this. And I remember one afternoon I was taken aside by some professors at Australian National University in Canberra. And they said, oh look, tomorrow you've got to come to a house in Canberra, because we actually need to talk to you. And I knew I was in trouble. Like, I felt like a kid at school had been told to wait for the headmaster. And they took me aside for that morning tea. They called it a morning tea. Tea was real good. The cake was pretty good. But they said, we don't want you talking about this anymore because it didn't happen. Your people didn't build houses. They didn't have crops. They didn't have fish traps. And I said, what are you saying? They said, well, we don't want you talking to our students about these things. So I left there, and I had a very bad car at that stage, and I remember getting in that car and steam was coming out of my head because I was that upset You could say it was anger, but I think it was just being upset. And I said to myself then, if these people, the most intelligent people in Australia, or some of the most intelligent people in Australia, the best educated people in Australia, at the Australian National University, can't be convinced by these things, then how do I tell this story? And I went straight to a second-hand bookshop and I bought Sir Thomas Mitchell's Journeys into Tropical Australia, about this country here and a bit further south to the border. And on about page 89, I read where Mitchell and all his party rode through 9 miles of Sturt grain. 9 miles. I was already a history graduate. I'd been teaching history for 25 years. And I'd never, ever read anything like this. Why? Mitchell's journal is available to all of us. How come, as a university history student, I hadn't read that? Because it had been hidden. This incredible piece of information. 9 miles of Sturt grain. The old people harvesting that grain and building ricks of it. They're all English agricultural terms because they were Englishmen who were writing this. They called them ricks. They said they were stooped. They said the field had been harvested, and they knew they'd been harvested by this yuan knife, a big blade with a fur handle, so it was comfortable for the harvester. And I was shocked, but I also thought at that very moment, I can tell this story now because I'm telling it from a white man's point of view. They don't have to argue with me, they have to argue with themselves. But the thing that shocks you, I hope it shocks you, is that hundreds of Australian professors had read that and had never thought to tell their children or anyone else's children this exciting piece of information about Australian history. When I went to university, I wanted to study history because I was in the middle of this search for country and family. And the professors there said, oh look, we don't teach Australian history here. And I said, why not? And they said, well, nothing happened. You know, we didn't have Guy Fawkes. We didn't have queens cutting off their sisters' heads. We didn't have kings cutting off their their wives' heads. So there was no history. And that just drove me to want to know more and more and more. And there's a story that I tell all the time, which is like the Mitchell story. It says so much about what was hidden from us about our own country. Charles Sturt, who was probably one of the better explorers, because I've read a lot about Sturt, I can find no reference to him having shot people. Virtually all the other explorers shot our people. But I can't find that reference to Sturt. So he's one of the better people in that regard. But he's got all his men with him and all the horses, and he's going from Adelaide. He's trying to find the inland sea. It was a big thing in those days that, you know, Europeans thought there had to be an inland sea. Well, there had been, but they were 180,000 years late. It had been there, but it was gone. Someone pinched it. But Charles Sturt comes to the drier parts of Australia, climbing over all those sand hills, up one, down the other side, up another one, down the other side. The horses are getting weak, they're dying. The men have got no food, they start eating horses. And they've all got scurvy because they didn't have vegetables. And so Sturt is going blind. He can hardly see. But on the last sand hill, he gets up there, he looks down into the valley, and there are 40 old Aboriginal people down there harvesting grain. And they stop what they're doing and turn up and look at the top of the ridge there, and they see this man. They've never seen a white man before. And what Sturt says was, we started down the edge of that dune and we were so weak and our horses were so weak that we could only walk in a straight line. If those people had had any intention of evil toward us, we would have been dead. But instead he saw the people, some of the people moving away, and by the time he got down to the bottom of the hill, they brought out a kulamon of water so that those explorers could drink. And then those people, never seen a white man, they've certainly never seen a horse, turned around and let the horses drink. And the whiskers of the horses touched their fingers, and yet those people stood there and let this incredible beast drink from the trough. Sturt says the courage and grace of these people is incredible. This animal they've never seen before, they still recognise it as another beast, one of us, and allowed it to drink. And then they were led to a brand new house on the opposite bank of this dry riverbed where the harvest had been taking place. And they were shown where they could sleep. They were given a bundle of firewood to light their fire, and then those people fed them roast duck and cake. That's what Sturt says, roast duck and cake. Wouldn't our children, our babies, love to grow up having heard that story of humanity, generosity and affluence, roast duck and cake? Our people were living high on the hog, as they say now. Fat of the land, as Steinbeck would have said, and the Bible said. Our people were living well, and obviously thought any other people that came onto that country should be able to share that food. That is such a wonderful story. Sturt says about the evening that as it began to get dark, you could see all the fires of each of the families lighting up around this valley, and the kids were laughing, the dogs were barking, and you could hear the whir of the grain mills that as the women ground the grain into bread, into flour, and then baked the bread for that night's dinner. And he said that around about 10 o'clock, the camp was silent. Everyone had gone to bed. They'd all eaten, they'd all sung, some of them had danced, and by 10 o'clock, they were all in bed. A model civilization. Our old people, so civilized. And I thought, why? Why don't we tell this to our children? They would love to know that story about the dogs and the children and the dancers and the singers and the food. Over in Western Australia, there was a foppish Englishman Lieutenant Grey, he was rich enough to go into the army and make himself a lieutenant straight away. No private for him, straight up lieutenant. And because he was rich enough, he said, I want to become an explorer. He'd been brought up on all the old stories of those imperial British explorers like Stanley and people like that in Africa, and he wanted to do it for himself. And he was rich enough to say, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. But he's also stupid. And so when he landed at Broome with his whaleboats and all the food on them, they tipped over, they drowned horses, all the flour went into the sea and was ruined. And then he had nothing except a few men, and he had to walk south to Perth, go back to where he came from, but he had to walk this time. And he's walking and walking through this country, and then he comes to a field, and he calls it a field because he's an Englishman, but he can't see the end of it. And he says, it was so deeply tilled, I couldn't walk across it. Tilled, I thought. No one ever told me, in all my years of schooling, no one ever told me how people tilled, dug the ground, tilled. It's in there. It's in that book. And no one, not one professor, not one teacher, not one missionary, not one politician ever thought to tell our babies that the first Australian people tilled the land. Why not? And then after reading all these things, and I found that Warburton found people building dams, great granite walls to direct the water that fell on that granite slope into the fields of their tubers that they were growing. And I'm thinking, how can you organise silence like this? How can you deny this information so efficiently to a whole nation? How can you do it? We talk about Hitler as if he's the devil, which he was. How did he organise all the Germans to do what they did to the Jewish people of Europe? And yet here, all our professors, our mild-mannered professors, living in Canberra, grassy lawn, lovely deciduous trees, silver spoons and forks and knives on the table, cloth napkins, lovely soup for dinner. Those people never wanted our people to know these stories. So, Dark Emu, all the fuss about Dark Emu, but it's just already been there. It was always there. But all those old white men, and they were old, and they were white, and they were men, all those old white men decided that you and your children, your babies, didn't need this knowledge. Because if you had that knowledge, you would start to wonder, how come Australia was able to take this land? Because what they did tell us in school, what I learned on King Island, was that our people were so stupid, so slow, so lazy, so inhuman, that we didn't deserve the land. That's why they were measuring our heads to see how much brain we had. And as soon as they discovered that Aboriginal people had slightly more brain than a white man, they stopped doing it. But that's what they were trying to prove, that our people weren't human. And yet, they knew, because they'd been passing through all these fields. They'd seen the stooks, they'd seen the tilling, they'd seen the roast duck and cake, they'd seen the grace and generosity of the people, but that was an inconvenient fact. So I didn't want to lower the mood, and I want you to have a good night, but there is an upside to the story because, people have, ever since dark emu became pretty popular, there have been people in the country who thought, we've got to stop this fella. And so they've attacked me. Not a real black fella, I admit that I'm white. Sorry, I had no control over that. But what happened as a result was that Australians bought dark emu in lots of a dozen and gave them to their sisters and brothers and cousins and aunties as a rebellion. And that provided me with enough money to employ local Yuin men. I acknowledge the Yui from here, but we on south coast New South Wales, east of Victoria, we're Yuin. I've been employing those fellas from Yuin country to grow our old grains. The grains that Mitchell saw, the grains that those old people near Lake Eyre were growing. We're growing our tubers. In Melbourne, the hillsides were contoured. When Europeans arrived, they couldn't understand it until they realised that Aboriginal people were tilling the hillsides for murnon, for yam. And that operation had been going for so long that the whole hillside was ringed with these contours. What an incredible thing. How come we didn't know about it? So that's what we're doing on the farm on the bank of the Wallagra River. And we do it with ceremony. Not every day, but 2 or 3 times a week there is some ceremonial act we perform for the grain, for the tuber, for lighting the fire, for eating the food. Because that's the law of that country. So we try not just to grow food and sell it, make money and employ all those lads and girls. We're doing it so we're demonstrating that we're following our law, and that those grains and tubers have a story. They're not just food, they're not just plants, they have a story, and that story, you can read it in the sky, you can read it on the ground. Everything in the sky is on the ground, and vice versa. But now people in Australia, having suffered what are called droughts, sometimes, our old people didn't talk about droughts, they talked about dry seasons, but they also talked about other food. If there's a drought and that one doesn't grow, there's another food. Go to that food, that's its time. Go to that food, grow that one. And we're very lucky down there that we're growing, say, 8 tubers, we're harvesting 7 or 8 grasses. So if one doesn't come up, we go to the other one. This is just an alternative way of farming. And there are people who say that I'm insulting Aboriginal people by saying we weren't hunters and gatherers. Nothing wrong with being a hunter and gatherer. It's a very healthy lifestyle. But the fact is, hunters and gatherers don't build dams. They don't dig wells. They don't stook grain. They don't till the earth. And our people did. And some people get upset with me about using not wanting to admit to being hunters and gatherers. But why? Why would we accept a European term to define us? Why not have our word? And our word is who we are. You. Ewan for me. You know, Gunditchmar, Yoda Yoda, whoever. That's who we are. We're not hunter-gatherer. We're not semi-literate people. We are who we are. And, you know, for all the people of Mackay, there is a very big story here of people who've been here for 120,000 years, minimum. Now, down in Portland last year, people get excited when I say 120,000 years. You can't say that, you know. What about out of Africa? Why do you want to learn about Africa? You know, 75,000 years people came out of Africa. Jim Bowler, old archaeologist, who so-called discovered Mungo Man and Mungo Lady, and our old people, or those people from that country, they say don't, they found him. He did archaeology at Warrnambool, and the result came up 120,000 years, and so many archaeologists in this country refused to believe it. Well, hang on, just hang on, because there's more coming. It won't be 120,000 years. If they're worried about 120,000 years, they're going to spoil their breakfast when they find out about 140. This is happening. You know, it's real. It's white science. So, you know, our old people had science too. You need science to make a dam. You need science to make a fish trap. We had all that. But as Australians, as people of Mackay, we've got this fabulous story which is open to us. Everybody can learn this story because it's about land care. It's about the mother, Mother Earth, and how to look after her. And you don't look after Mother Earth by destroying the ocean. You don't look after Mother Earth by destroying the soil. You don't look after Mother Earth by emptying the river entirely. You don't look after Mother Earth by poisoning the river and poisoning the reef offshore. That is not how you care. And a lot of farmers in this recent decade, when, you know, so-called drought has been challenging people, and the bushfires on the east coast of Australia scared the living daylights out of people, including me. People have begun thinking, I wonder if there's another way. Yeah, there's another way. There's another way to look after Mother Earth. And that way is to look and listen and learn about her. What does she want? Because our old people, I don't know where they are, our old people say, we don't own anything. She owns us. She owns us. And when you start thinking like that, it is a completely different way of using the human intellect. Because if you believe that you belong to Mother Earth, not the other way around, then you start treating her differently. Because Christians and Muslims both believe, and they say so in the holy books, that man shall have dominion over the earth. Our people have the opposite, completely opposite viewpoint, that we belong to her. She does not belong to us. And if we belong to her, she being our mother, we have to treat her like our mother. So, would you aerial spray with poison your mother? You know, down south just recently, someone in the district wanted to kill blackberry, and so sprayed 3 farms. 2 of them weren't his. Sprayed blackberry, like throwing sand at a shithouse wall. You know, how direct can you get? You can't. It's, half of it's going to go straight into the river, because my country is full of rivers and lakes. You can't keep it out of the water. That's not caring, and we need to start caring. And we need to ask those questions, and we will get kickback from people who say, oh, don't you want an economy? Well, yeah, our people had an economy too, you know, and everyone was employed. Everyone got fed. Everyone had a house. Everyone took part in culture. That was our economy, and it worked pretty well. That is an economy. And we know you've got economy too, but why are people living under bridges? Why are young people hurting themselves? Are they that shocked by what's going on in the community, with what their adults are doing, their parents are doing? Are they that shocked that they want to end their lives? We have to think about those things. We have to provide a better world for them. And the old people's way of caring for Mother Earth, I'm certain that is the way. Modern Australian farmers, non-Aboriginal people, are starting to grow those perennial grains because the biggest expense on their balance sheet is chemicals. Not tractors, not fuel, not labour, but chemicals. And I'll tell you a story about an old white man who lost everything to a bushfire in central New South Wales about 18 years ago. He lost everything. And like a lot of Australians, he loves his land, you know? He loves his land. And he looked around and everything was gone except the land. And he said, what have I got? What have I got left? No fences, no sheds, no house, no crops, no nothing. What have I got? And he looked around and there was a little bit of rain came, then the grass came up, and it was what we call mamaja nunuk, dancing grass. And the other one there was burul nunuk, kangaroo grass. He said, well, that's what I've got. So he started harvesting those grains, and he's never looked back. He was able to rebuild his house, put the fences up, made a living out of those grains. His income went down, but his profit went up because he was able to make a profit because he used no chemicals at all. He didn't need to because the grass came up. You know, I was at an agricultural conference about 5 years ago, and one of the farmers said, we spent all this money spraying weeds so that plants that don't want to grow here can grow. And we should be eating the weeds, which cost nothing. And so Jess has been talking about sustainable agriculture, things we might do for our catchments, our reef catchments. And I think there's so much we can do. We can do it as Australians, together. And we can listen to the old people for once and say, what would you do now? What would you do here? And I wish they had asked those questions of the old people in the Murray-Darling Basin. Because so clever was the Murray-Darling Basin Authority that when they privatised the water there, they thought it was a really good idea to sell more water than was actually in the river. You know, because you can do that with paper money, you can do that with gold, you can actually sell more than exists. But it makes it really difficult for fish. Because what a fish needs is water. And that authority thought it was really good commerce to sell more water than actually existed. And then the fish die, and the newspaper reporters and the television reporters throw their hands up. Oh, this is drought. No, it's not drought. It's greed. You know, one of the people who used to work on that authority said to me the other day, you know, he said, people are funny because someone bought a parcel of water that didn't exist and they paid $70 million for it because they thought it was a futures investment. You know, we have to stop this nonsense. You know, we're always going to need an economy. You know, I argue against capitalism, you know, selling $70 million of water that doesn't exist. That is not a really good idea. But I'm not anti-capitalist, I'm anti-stupidity. I'm not pro-communist because the communists trained the Aral Sea to grow cotton. So it's not an either-or argument. It's about Mother Earth. That's all it's about. It's about looking after her. You want to cut off your mother's legs? You want to deny her water when she needs water? That's what it is. You've got to think about your mother and what she needs. And I'm really hopeful that we can do this together as people, as humans, as Australians, black and white, whatever, that we can see the sense in looking after our ground like we would our mother, and to avoid the obvious mistakes. We don't want to make those same mistakes again. You know, we've got evidence here, evidence in my country, like spraying blackberries from the air, all of those things. We can avoid them. We need to be very careful about fire. We don't want those wildfires again. But since the fires in my country, on my farm there, you know, the regrowth is like this now. It'll go off like a bomb. We need to be burning that now. We've done it on the farm, and we're not allowed to do it off the farm. But we should be doing it everywhere. Nice, gentle burns, keeping the grass low, new food for kangaroos and possums, all those animals, wombat. We can do this and have a better country. Like the old people had this country, where there were really big trees, not as many of them, but really big trees, and crops underneath, monon. You know, the old surveyors used to call it herbage. It wasn't herbage for us. It was potatoes and carrots and onions. You know, we had our own potatoes, carrots and onions. We're growing them on the farm. It wasn't herbage to us. It was crops. Because they couldn't believe that Aboriginal people had crops. We can do this together, this new kind of farming. And I'm hoping that it will bring us close together. You know, I see so many of our old people getting insulted simply because they disagree. You know, when someone disagrees with you, it's a really good time to listen, to test your own truth. And in Australia, you know, I think we're in for a really big change. I think 10 years' time it'll be really hard to recognise the conversation we're having. It might be because, you know, we've learned a lot from the fires, or we've learned a lot from climate change. You know, we've had to change our conversation. It might be because of that, but who cares? As long as the conversation changes, as long as our councils and our governments, when they start to think about aerial spraying for a particular weed, they think, hang on, that's not going to work. Why don't we employ a lot of people and make half of those people Aboriginal? And why don't we pull those weeds instead of poisoning those weeds, like the old people used to do? You know, when all the saplings and things used to come up, the old people down south used to walk through the bush and they'd pull them up like this because they were protecting their crops. They already had the big trees they wanted. They'd been working on that for 70,000 years. Now they're just gardening, just weeding. We can do a lot of things that are better for the earth. They are labour intensive, but we've got unemployed people. And we've got people who really would benefit from being in the bush. So why aren't we using people like that? You know, my own people are working hard at the moment to try and get control of a fish trap at Bermagui. It's the old traditional fish trap. Look, I could tell you a story about that which is, you know, make you nearly cry. It's that, make you so proud to be an Australian, to hear how the old people made that fish trap. And they won't give it to us. And it costs them nothing, because they don't want it. But all we want to do is rebuild that fish trap. We want our young people to go out there at every low tide and pick up the fish and sell it at the market. That's all we want. We want to be able to use that old fish trap. And we're not being allowed to do that. But I think before 10 years out, we will, because there are a lot of Australians who want things to change. There are a lot of us young Australians in particular who want to listen to Aboriginal people, because there's so much, I'm not going to say wisdom because that word is way, way overused. There's so much common sense amongst our people about how to care for country and how to make a living of country. And maybe we have to talk about population. Maybe, you know, what I'm talking about is pie in the sky, that we can't feed enough people if we did it that way, because there's more and more and more and more and more people. And can our Mother Earth support that many people? Maybe that's a conversation we have to have too, and that's a really tough one. Because once again, our books, the sacred books, say go forth and multiply. Well, how much can she stand, that old Mother Earth? She is not an accounting register. She is a woman of the earth. So we can't treat her like a row of beads that we just count off in the thousands. You know, we have to think about that, but that's another story again. And I haven't even talked to you about my football career, but I could. Wasn't much good, but I enjoyed it. But anyway, I've been talking a while now, and I think there's something else going to happen now, ain't it?
Wow. Thank you so much, Bruce. I'm not sure about everyone else here, but I know myself, I'm just so inspired by the notion that we can look back at our collective history and at the same time look forward. So I'd like to give another round of applause to Bruce. We do have a small amount of time for questions. We may not get through them all, but I'll invite you to raise your hands and we might get some questions for Bruce, if that's okay. Any questions out there?
Oh, okay. Bruce, I was sort of interested in when you went to university and were so rejected by the academia. Because my experience is different. I remember attending Griffith University in Brisbane in the 1980s, and you know, people like Athol Chase were talking about Indigenous agricultural systems, and then in the 90s here at Central Queensland Uni, we were through that Indigenous studies program there. They talked about eel farming in the Otways and all those other sort of systems that were around, and housing and that sort of thing. So there must have been a change at some time. So I'm sort of interested in when and what you experienced in that change.
Well, see, you're such a young man.
Yeah, that's right.
That things did start to change, and it did start to change when Jim Bowler was doing his archaeology, and it was around about that time that they found the Goodnich Murra eel traps and things like that in the stone houses. And there were some visionaries in Australia who were deciding that there was a story to tell about Aboriginal Australia. So things did start to change. Manning Clark was a hero in the 1960s as an historian. In those 4 volumes of Australian history, no mention of Aboriginal people at all. Maybe a few paragraphs at the very beginning. And, he was the champion of Australian history, the champion of the left, a champion of intellectual thought. And yet he never mentioned Aboriginal people at all. So a lot changed. And you experienced that change. My grandchildren are experiencing a little change. And I'm expecting that change to really mount and become inexorable in the country. That's what I want for Australia, that we all learn these things together. But the hardest thing, you didn't ask this question, but I'm going to answer it. One of the hardest things for this country is to make sure that from all the profit made from all the grasses, all the tubers, all the water savings this country will implement very shortly, is that Aboriginal people are included in it. That's the toughest thing. The hard thing is not to grow these plants. The hard thing isn't to harvest them. The hard thing isn't to sell them. The hard thing isn't to make a profit from them. The hard thing is to make sure that Aboriginal people are included. How can Aboriginal people be included if we haven't got land? That's the hard thing. Don't talk about closing the gap. Don't talk about this authority or that authority or that Royal Commission until Australians, like all the chefs at home, Sydney Morning Herald last weekend had a recipe for kangaroo grass crumpets. I gave him the flour for that. He's a really nice man. I like him a lot. He's got a rotten little car, which I don't like. But, he's not a rich man. But he's a famous man now because, he's making food from Indigenous plants. He's famous for that. Does he employ Aboriginal people? No. Does he mention Aboriginal people? Yes. But where do we profit from it? He's getting no more flour from me until he shows me how Aboriginal people are going to benefit. Now, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority will start growing perennial grasses. We might start growing them up here for all I know. But where do Aboriginal people benefit? Where are we employed here? Where do we take home our $1,000 for the week and put new tyres on our ute? Where are our people in this? That's what I want. That's why those lads down south, when we first started working, they had the worst cars I'd ever seen, like completely unroadworthy. And all their early money went in just getting a decent vehicle so they could come to work. But they did want to come to work because it's their country, it's UN land. And I was away a fortnight ago and they sent me a video of them lighting a fire to burn the country traditional way. They all had their headbands on. I just cried. seeing my people doing that. You know, these young lads, there's no one supervising them. They could have had the day off, gone fishing. No, there they are, working away. So much pride. Anyway, I've asked myself a question and I've answered.
We're obviously all reading Dark Emu, some of us are rereading it. I'd like to know what you're reading.
I'm reading a book about mycorrhizal fungus by Julie, can you yell out the name?
Sheldrake.
Yeah, a fellow called Sheldrake. And it's talking about how all the plants talk to each other underneath the ground with all these little connections of the mycorrhizal fungus, and that's what makes them grow well. You put superphosphate on the ground, all those chemicals, poison chemicals, you kill it stone dead. So then the only way you can make that ground grow something is put more chemicals onto it. But if you leave the country alone and let all those fungi underneath the ground contact all the roots of all the grasses, all the tubers, they'll all grow together. And you know, it's modern science, but it's telling a very old story, and I'm reading that book. Julie gave me a book by Judith Wright, which talks about her grandfather seeing the country in New England and how, looking from the top of the hill, it was spread out like a gentleman's park. This is at contact, because her grandparents were the first white people to take that land from our people, and it was spread out like a park. That's what the old people had done. They made Australia into a parkland, a productive parkland. And so I'm reading that. I've got about another 6 books I'm reading, but that'll do.
Jess,
We'll
a
add
question?
that to our list.
Question
Have we got a
over here?
question over here? Feel free, please stand up.
I just wanted to know, from living in Mackay, how we, or me and some of my Aboriginal friends, how we could build a fish trap. Build a fish trap. How do you build a fish trap?
Well, you've got the answer in this room. The moon can tell you that. Because those fish traps still exist.
Yeah, there's one at Armstrong Beach.
Yeah, they're all around. They're at home, and they're sometimes a bit subtle, and they've been a bit damaged. Like Brewarrina is a really good example. But that's a great question, and the answer is here, and it'd be a great thing to do. A perpetual fish catching machine. Who would have thought of it? The old people. Because it's totally sustainable. Tide comes in, tide goes out, fish in your trap, but not all the fish. You don't catch all the fish. When I lived at Apollo Bay, there was, we used to catch barracuda there. And so all the fishermen went out chasing barracuda. Within 30 years there were no barracuda. None. That's not the way to treat the earth. Orange roughy, when it first started getting fish, they went from all the orange roughy in the sea, they went within a bees of destroying that fish. This is not good economy. Destroying your resource is not good economy.
Do we have a question over here? Yep.
Bruce, thank you for tonight, firstly. My question is about the devastating fires on your country last year, and about how this country has sat up and taken notice of the Indigenous ways of burning, patchwork burning. A lot of councils around the country, including I think ours, are taking up on that. I just want your view on what's going on and if that's still continuing.
Yeah, it is. I've worked with Vic Stephenson in Sydney, just the other day. People are paying a lot of attention to it, but it's not a panacea. You know, burning is not good in itself. It has to be done right way for right country. The burn that Vic does up in Queensland is not the same burn that we do down at home. Have to look at country, and one of the dangers is if you want to burn, but all the land is farmland, the only burn you can do is on dry hillsides, then you're possibly burning country that the old Aboriginal people would never have burned. So you have to look at country really carefully and know the story of that country and burn it accordingly. So it's about resource management, you know, and you know, we have to be flexible about resources, because the use of some resources is dangerous, and we have to control ourselves as economic beasts to make sure that we're not making a profit and damaging the earth at the same time. So resource management, whether it's fire, whatever it is, we have to be really careful and ask ourselves the same question: how do we look after Mother Earth? Because what a lot of the things that we're doing in the world today is as if we despise our grandchildren. We really despise our grandchildren because we don't care what world they live in. If we cared for our grandchildren, and we should ask all of our prime ministers and all our politicians of whatever stripe, we have to ask them, what are we going to have for our grandchildren? So I've asked myself another question and answered it. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
We might have time for one more question.
My father, Monty Pryor, he was a priest, and he went over to Scotland because he took two other blokes with him. They had our Aboriginal people over there in a museum there with and they're all about at the foreheads, big heads, big foreheads, and they had them there. And he said, "I'm going to bring them home." So he went over and he brought them home, and so he had them in boxes and everything. Put it at the house, our place. He said to Mum, I brought them back, they're only at the house. She said, what? She said, no, I've talked to them, but we're going to try and find out. We don't know where the country is, where they come from, but we're going to, you know, bring them back and bury them here. Anyway, so then all the elders got together, and they talked about it, and they said, what are we going to do? So, you know, we're up there in Bowen now. They have got, not up in Bowen, up in Home Hill, they've got the snake there in a park. Well, that's where they buried them. So he said, we found a home for them there. So we had a big celebration about that. So, yeah, my father was a priest. He ended up being ordained by John Paul II. Yeah, when he came out to Mount Isa out there. So, yeah, I'd just like to tell you that. But they're about this head. I'm saying, what they put in the museum for? So they brought the skeletons back and buried them. And so they're at rest now. So, yeah. So, yeah. I'll let you know that. Yeah. Yeah, Monty Pryor. Monty, there is a brother, I've got a brother named Monty Pryor that he does write books and everything. That's my brother. But this is my father. His name's Monty Pryor, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
So, great storyteller, eh?
What's that?
Monty Pryor.
Monty Pryor. Yes, that's, yep.
Great storyteller, yeah, I've heard
He
him.
does write books too, and he goes around and he goes to schools, and he still does it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my brother.
And, you know, all the museums have artefacts of our people, and, you know, when are they going to come home? You know,
Yeah.
when we were talking about Australia Museum this morning, and about how jealously they guard all the Aboriginal artefacts.
Yeah.
But they've never been displayed. They've just been kept there, hoarding, you know, like what was it Gollum in the Lord of the Rings, who went to sleep on golden rings? Well, it's like that they're doing with our old people's things, and you know, those beautiful old grinding dishes and things, which actually are proof of our agricultural economy. They've never been displayed, but there's rooms, you know, like really big lounge rooms, like small town halls, full of those grinding dishes. Why do you collect them if you don't want to show them to anyone? And when we went to go and see those grinding dishes, they refused us entry. Refused us entry. It took us 6 months to argue our way in there to see those grinding dishes, because there was one stone there we wanted to see. It was that big because one of the young brothers, Jonathan Jones, a good young Wiradjuri artist, he took a photograph of that stone and did a study of it, and he found that it had a handle attached to it that long, and it had been bound onto this stone, and the edge of it had never been used on wood, it had never been used on stone, it had only ever been used on soil. So if you've got an implement that long, it was a pick. And when we went into the museum, we suspected there might be a few more. There were thousands. And now here's a stone which tells you everything about Australian Aboriginal agriculture. Never, ever, ever appeared in any Australian textbook. Never. And that young man, that young Wiradjuri man, he's skinny as a rake. You know, you breathe hard, you knock him over. But he took that photograph, first photograph of what those old people used. And I said to him, my brother, I'm so glad you've taken that photograph. I feel so much emotion that you've given me that photograph, because I want every Australian child to see that photograph, to know what our people were, not hunters and gatherers. Those old people, you know, this is a story I'm sure more and more people want to know. You know, some old men my age may not want to know that. They'll be gone. But we want our babies, our children, to know that story of how wonderful those old people were, those old Australians, so that all Australians can be proud to own up to the fact that Aboriginal people have been here for 120,000 years with a government that was so strong. I'm talking to you fellas down there now, right? A government where fellas your age, you know, feeling your muscles, you know, big man now, but you talk to your old grannies, your old uncles, your old grandfathers, and they talk to you about their government, which has so much common sense to it, is so egalitarian, and you young fellas say, yeah, you're right. It is right for everybody to have a house, everybody to have enough to eat, everybody to be looked after when they're old, everybody to take part in culture. So you say to your uncle, I'll protect that, I will protect that culture. And that happened for 120,000 years. So fellas your age, 120,000 years ago, decided that an egalitarian culture, which revered Mother Earth, which didn't revere gold, the only civilization on earth that never went to war for the land, you said to your uncle, yeah, uncle, you're right.
Thank you. I'd like to thank everyone for coming again tonight, and especially to Bruce to come to Mackay. I know it wasn't a short journey, and Bruce has sold out entire entertainment centres in Sydney. So this is a much smaller audience than what he's used to. But I really hope that he appreciates the ripple effects that his talk will have in our community. So thanks again. We'll have a really quick break, and then we will be in the foyer to sign books.